Greg is an associate professor at the Shar School of Policy and Government. He's also the director for the biodefense program at George Mason, which I actually went through a class or two of him. He's a former Stanton Fellow, and he did some work with nonproliferation from the Council on Foreign Affairs Relations. Today, he's probably wearing his hat as a member of the Scientists Working Group and the Chem Bio Weapons at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation out in DC. So I don't want to take any more of his time. Please welcome Greg.
Thank you, Paris, and thanks to Brad also for having me out here again. It's nice to be back at CGSR. Today I want to talk to you about a new theoretical model for understanding the proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons that I call the regime security model. And I think this model helps explain some of the biggest puzzles we're facing right now in the world of proliferation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what this model entails, and then use it to look at why we thought Saddam Hussein was still possessed weapons of mass destruction in 2002, 2003, when he in fact didn't. And then also try to understand the motivations for Bashar al-Assad to use chemical weapons within Syria, even though many times that seems to be a counterproductive or strategically irrational move. And I think both these puzzles don't make sense when you look at their motivations from a national security perspective, but when you look at their behavior through the lens of regime security, it makes a lot more sense. So first, again, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the regime security model is, how it fits into the broader academic literature about the motivations for countries to develop and use nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. I'll go through these two case studies, hopefully briefly, and then talk about some of the policy implications that flow from this research. This talk is based on a couple articles that I've written and a couple more that are still in process. And so I put the citations at the end of the talk. But if any of you are interested in kind of further reading, or if you have more questions about it, happy to share those articles with you as well. So the academic literature on why countries develop, use, and get rid of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, which I'll just use the WMD shorthand just for the sake of simplicity, is basically divided into three groups. There's the national security model, the domestic politics model, and the prestige model. And if you break down what are the variables that these different theories are based on, it's really two different variables. One is asking, what are the benefits that a country thinks it will get out of developing these weapons, right? Are these primarily political benefits, where these are weapons that have some symbolic or political importance to them? Or do they look at these weapons as a means of enhancing their security, whether through deterrence or coercion or warfighting? So are there political or security benefits they think will flow from pursuing and acquiring these weapons? And then the second variable is who's the target audience? Are these benefits going to derive at the domestic level, trying to impress domestic audiences, or is the target other states? So there's an international audience that they're seeking to influence. And so if you take these two different variables, right, you create this nice little 2x2 table, gives you four different models that are the main theories that are used in social sciences and academia to explain why countries develop these weapons. So you have the domestic politics model, which says that countries develop these weapons because of the desires, the narrow parochial interests of strong scientific leaders, of industry, or of the military. Right? So these are kind of bottom-up programs that are driven by actors that have vested interest in pursuing and acquiring these weapons. You have the national security model that says that countries pursue these weapons because they are trying to deter a country that has similar weapons, or maybe deter or confront a country that has a stronger conventional force. And so they're being motivated by external security threats to acquire nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. And this is obviously the dominant model in the policy world. This is the dominant model really in academia for trying to explain why do countries want WMD. And then you have the prestige model that says that countries look at these weapons as symbols of modernity, symbols of having advanced technology, and so this gives them status in the international system. And so developing these weapons in order to put themselves in the nuclear club because they think that will increase their standing internationally. Now that is primarily a function in the nuclear field, where that is the case. In the field of chemical and biological weapons, right, that's kind of it's the opposite case. There's a very strong stigma against acquiring and admitting you have chemical and biological weapons, there's a very strong norm against the use of these weapons that's reinforced by different international treaties. So prestige has been a driving force more in the nuclear field than the chemical and biological field. But it's worth noting that the theories that have been developed to explain proliferation typically started in the nuclear realm, just because we've kind of more evidence and people have kind of spent a lot more time working on that. But all these theories you can find evidence of in the realm of chemical and biological proliferation as well. So you can see these same motivations at play for countries trying to get nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. But what you'll notice is, right, this top right cell here is empty. Right? The domestic security benefits a state can acquire from obtaining these weapons is an area that has gotten very little attention. Right? So this is what I call the regime security model. And there is actually a fair amount of historical, empirical evidence that governments have developed and used chemical and biological weapons for domestic security purposes. So a long history of countries using chemical and biological warfare agents to assassinate dissidents or critics or domestic rivals. The most famous recent example, of course, is the assassination of Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia, who is the half-brother of Kim Jong-un and was seen as a threat to Kim Jong-un's power in Pyongyang. And he was assassinated using the VX nerve agent in the Malaysian airport just earlier this year. But there's a long history of countries like Iraq, Soviet Union, Russia, South Africa, also using these kinds of agents for political assassination purposes. And separately, you have also a long history of countries using chemical and biological weapons for counterinsurgency operations, using these weapons against rebel groups in their countries. And so you have cases in Iraq, South Africa, Rhodesia, and of course Syria today, where chemical weapons have become integrated into the Syrian military's campaign against the rebel forces there. And yet, despite this, fairly significant empirical base, right, there's been very little theorizing about why do countries develop weapons for this purpose. Very little analysis of why they do this, how they do this, and very little about the implications of this for nonproliferation policy. Right. So that's the gap I was trying to fill in the literature, is to try and understand better how can regime security motivate countries to acquire, develop, use primarily chemical and biological weapons. But at the end, I'll talk about how this applies to nuclear as well. Right. So you're asking yourself, what is regime security? So regime security can be defined as a condition where governing elites are secure from violent domestic challenges to their rule. Right? So the idea that governments that are primarily non-democratic, let me back up. So the key thing about regime security, one of the major differences it has from the other theories, is that it takes the regime as a unit of analysis. It says it's not the state that we're worried about, it's the regime. It's the ruling elite who hold the highest political positions in a country and who most often control the coercive machinery of a government and that basically run a country. They're the elite that we have to know about their decision-making processes, their beliefs, their values to understand what's driving their motivations and their behaviors. And one of the key elements of this is that whenever you have a government that holds onto power through non-democratic means, it usually means that they have what's called an insecurity dilemma. All right? They have a lack of political legitimacy, a lack of social cohesion, low institutional capacity, domestic sources of instability that keep that elite and that regime vulnerable, or at least perceive themselves to be vulnerable to being overthrown by their own people. And as a result, governments that are authoritarian or autocratic, right, who have this regime insecurity, they typically look at threats to their survival as much coming from internal sources as external sources, right? And if you think about in terms of history, the number of countries that have, the number of leaders and governments that have been overthrown by foreign troops is relatively small, right? The number of governments that have been changed through force by domestic rivals, through coups, assassinations, popular revolutions is much larger. Right, so authoritarian leaders have good reason to fear their own people more than foreign armies. And as a result, right, they will look at security threats not just from the external national security perspective. They'll look at also at how do these threats affect my stability as a regime. What this also means is that leaders will fear losing office, not just because they will lose the privileges and perks of being the dictator or the king, but very often your political position guarantees your survival. when dictators are overthrown from office, they don't just lose a job, right? Usually they lose their life. If you look at the fate of the leaders from the Arab Spring who've been overthrown, right, in Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen, right, they did not, in Libya, right, they have not suffered very well. And so when you wonder about why Bashar al-Assad has fought so tenaciously to hold on to power, right, he has seen what happened to his fellow Arab autocrats, and he knows that he does not want to be exiled or put in jail or killed. And so his political survival, right, really is dependent on his physical survival. And so leaders who are facing regime insecurity, right, they place a premium on their personal survival and their personal safety. And what this means in terms of their behavior is leaders in this kind of position are going to try and find strategies that address both their external security threats and their domestic security threats at the same time, because they see threats from both ends. And this is very common throughout looking at how countries pick allies, how they, the types of weapons they buy, how they structure their militaries are influenced by these regime security considerations. So let me give you a concrete example from the non-WMD world. How many of you have heard of the idea of coup-proofing? Okay, a couple of people. So coup-proofing is when a leader is afraid of being overthrown by their own military. They will take steps to coup-proof their government. They will create multiple redundant overlapping security services that he can play or she can play off of one another. They'll promote officers based on their loyalty, not on their competence, to ensure that that military unit will not try and invade the capital and overthrow them. And what this can do is successfully prevent a military from overthrowing the leadership. But at the same time, usually this fatally undermines the effectiveness of that military on the battlefield. And we've seen this, for example, in Iraq in 2003, when U.S. forces were on the border. Even when U.S. tanks were rolling over the border into Iraq in 2003, the Iraqi Saddam Hussein was more worried about being overthrown by the Shurs and the Shia and the Kurds than he was by the U.S. Army. And so he had his military arrayed in such a way that they were not concentrated in one place to defend the capital, because that would have let in unreliable military units into the capital. And this is one of the reasons why the U.S. was able to get into Baghdad and overthrow the government so quickly, was the military was structured in such a way as to enhance its effectiveness against domestic enemies, even though it meant they were less prepared, less well-equipped, less well-positioned to deal with an external military threat. And so this area of proliferation is just yet another area where we see authoritarian regimes designing strategies that are suboptimal from a national security perspective, but they're designed to enhance their regime security and their ability to stay in power and hold on to power against domestic threats. And so when you look at what are some of the differences between these models, we've already talked about kind of the motivations for acquisition, right? What is it that drives countries to acquire these weapons? Another key difference is who are the actors involved in this acquisition process. Under the regime security model, the key actors are the intelligence security services, right? Because these are the organizations that are responsible for addressing the internal security threats in a country. So they will have a degree of involvement in these programs that you would not see if you have a program being motivated by national security concerns and you have the military in charge of procuring and buying and developing and using these weapons. And likewise, these weapons are used in a very different way by countries that are being motivated by regime security. So in the context of a WMD program being pursued for national security purposes, right, it will focus on developing weapons that are designed for use on a battlefield against other soldiers, or maybe designed for use at long range against civilian targets to maximize civilian casualties if a country is pursuing a deterrence doctrine. In contrast, for regime security, you're going to see weapons that are designed for use against individuals, small groups, civilians, guerrilla fighters, urban terrain, right? Not on the battlefield against other organized militaries. So you'll see very different types of weapons and doctrines and tactics adopted by a government that is being kind of motivated by this regime security mindset. And this underlines a more fundamental difference between national security and regime security, where national security is all about protecting a unified nation state against external military threats. Right? And that's the driving motivation. For regime security, it's all about keeping that ruling elite in power and protecting them from domestic threats that might emerge from either the military or tribal groups or popular uprisings. Okay, so let me give you a couple of cases of where we've seen regime security in action and how we've seen those kinds of considerations influence a government's WMD proliferation decision making. And the first case I'll talk about is the case of Iraq and Saddam Hussein, because we now know that after 1995, Saddam had basically completely disarmed of his WMD as required by UN Security Council resolutions. And yet, he still refused to cooperate fully with UN weapons inspectors throughout the late 1990s. And so it kept his government under sanctions and led to the perception that he still had WMD, which led eventually to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And as we'll see, Iraq didn't have any WMD after that point, and our understanding of why we thought Iraq pretended to have WMD is at the heart of understanding what was going on with Saddam Hussein. So just by way of background, after the 1991 Gulf War, the UN Special Commission, UNSCOM, and the IAEA were put in charge of disarming Iraq of its nuclear, biological, chemical, and missile programs. And for many years, Iraq followed what was called a cheat and retreat strategy. They would try and hide stuff from the UN as they could, but when they got caught, they would say, okay, yes, you've caught us, here it is, but we have no more. And then 2 weeks later, they'd find more. And, oh yeah, that's it, we're done, that's it. And so this cheat and retreat strategy went on for many years. And this was taken as evidence that Iraq was constantly, was still always hiding something, always hiding WMD. And this led eventually to UNSCOM and IAEA withdrawing from Iraq in 1998, and eventually leading to the demands of the Bush administration for Iraq to disarm, not being satisfied with the response, and leading to the US invasion in 2003. After the invasion, of course, the Iraq Survey Group scoured the country, found no evidence of any WMD programs or significant WMD materials even left over. And then the question became, okay, well, if Iraq really didn't have this stuff anymore, right, why didn't Saddam prove this to the world? Right? Why did he continue to obstruct the UN throughout the late 1990s if he really had nothing left? And at this time, Iraq was under UN sanctions. They were losing $10 billion a year in oil revenue sales. Right? So there's a real material cost to this kind of confrontational, obstructionist perspective. And so kind of logically, people say, well, why was Saddam acting this way? What was going on here? So the new conventional wisdom that emerged, that the Iraq Survey Group started, and others have picked up, including Steve Hadley, was Iraq was pursuing what they called a strategy of deterrence by doubt, right? Creating the impression, the illusion they had WMD still because they were still afraid of the external enemies, most notably the Iranians, right? And the idea was that Saddam wanted to project the aura or the illusion that he had WMD in order to deter his enemies, because in reality, right, his conventional military was very weak, and so he felt this was needed as a way of protecting his national security. This has been kind of adopted and accepted as the explanation by people like Steve Hadley, the leading academic experts in this field like Bob Jervis and Richard Betts also have written about this. Right, that Iraq, Saddam had this very clever strategy. It backfired right at the end, but there was this clever strategy of trying to use this illusion of having these weapons as a protective mechanism. I argue this is wrong. In reality, Saddam was all about protecting the regime security apparatus that kept him in power, and Saddam had built over many decades, right, a very impressive, very large, very well-resourced, very well-organized regime security apparatus comprised of multiple overlapping intelligence security agencies whose sole purpose was to keep him and his family in power. Right? And this worked for about 24 years. It was brutally efficient. They put down numerous tribal revolts. They uncovered numerous coup plots. They foiled assassination attempts. And so this was a very effective system despite all of the awful things that it did. And it was based on multiple overlapping security organizations. At the top of the pyramid was the Special Security Organization, the SSO, that was run by Saddam's son Qusay, which was the premier security agency in Iraq. They were responsible for guarding all the presidential palaces, guarding all the roads in Baghdad and Tikrit that connected the presidential sites. They were in charge of secure communications among all the presidential sites. And they're also in charge of spying on all the other security agencies. So the SSO basically had secret officers embedded everywhere else, so that if someone started to talk badly about Saddam or start plotting, right, SSO would know about it and they could take action. There were also the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard that were elite military units that were stationed in and around Baghdad in order to be in position to block any attempt by the regular army, right, the unreliable Shia majority army, to try and overthrow Saddam. And then you had multiple different intelligence agencies within Iraq who were all spying. They had foreign espionage responsibilities, they had domestic security responsibilities, and they all spied on each other as well. And so there's the perverse incentive system set up where basically these agencies, right, would be rewarded if they uncovered shenanigans going on in other intelligence agencies. And so this is a way to ensure that Saddam had multiple means of gathering intelligence on his own people to detect any coup plot as early as possible. So a very elaborate, very well-constructed, organized regime security apparatus. And as we'll see, right, this came under risk. So the way this came under risk was in August 1995, Hussein Kamal defects to Jordan. Hussein Kamal was not only Saddam's son-in-law, he was viewed as the second most powerful man in Iraq. He'd also spent 10 years developing and guarding Iraq's WMD programs. He'd been involved in the nuclear program, the chem bio program, the missile program from the mid-'80s up through the 1990s. So he knew everything that Iraq was still hiding from the UN. And so when he defected, the Iraqi government realized that they've now lost any ability to kind of lie and cheat with the UN, and so they purged all of their remaining documents and materials, and they shipped them all to this chicken farm that Hussein Kamal owned, and they said, "Oh, Hussein Kamal was hiding this material from you, and now we've uncovered it. We're giving it all to the UN, and now we've disarmed." And so this was a major turning point. This was the point at which basically Iraq really was functionally disarmed. They got rid of all their documents, all of their leftover materials from their WMD programs. And just to kind of, don't take my word for it, there is a memo that Hussam Amin wrote to Qusay. Hussam Amin was the head of the National Monitoring Directorate, which was the official Iraqi government agency working with UNSCOM and IEA. And he wrote a letter to Qusay right after Hussein Kamal defected, laying out all the areas that Hussein Kamal knew Iraq was lying and cheating and hiding from the UN. And so this was kind of their damage control briefing memo. Thanks to an organization called the Conflict Records Research Center at NDU, we have copies of these documents that the US forces recovered after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And if you go through this list, Hussein Kamal basically mentioned all of these secret areas that Iraq had been hiding, and Iraq basically came clean and revealed most information on these programs after his defection. One of the only areas where the Iraqis really held back on was talking about the role of SSO, the Special Security Organization, in monitoring the inspectors and in the concealment operations. Virtually everything else that Hussein Kamal disclosed, the Iraqis also came clean on as well. So this really does mark the functional disarmament of Iraq in 1995, by the end of 1995. So the question remains, okay, well, if this had happened, if the Iraqis came clean, they had given up all their materials, all their documents, so why did Saddam keep obstructing the inspectors, right? Why did he keep denying access to facilities and causing problems? So the answer is that the same time that Hussein Kamal defected and forced this big reveal by the Iraqi government, he also explained to UNSCOM how Iraq had this very elaborate concealment mechanism that was being run by the Special Security Organization, by the Special Republican Guard, by the Iraqi Intelligence Service, right, to hide all these materials and documents from UNSCOM from the end of the Gulf War up through 1995. And once UNSCOM learned about this concealment mechanism, their immediate assumption was, well, this thing is still in operation. They've given us some stuff, they're still hiding more, and so they launched what they called the counter-concealment inspections, where they needed to get to the bottom of what does this concealment mechanism do, how does it operate, and that's the only way they're going to actually ever get to the bottom of the Iraqi WMD programs. And so so UNSCOM launched this very aggressive series of inspections, no-notice inspections of the Iraqi equivalents of the FBI, CIA, DHS, NCTC, right? The most sensitive government facilities in Iraq right? These big groups of foreigners wanting to get access to on a moment's notice, and they had on paper the authority to go through any room, look at any document that they wanted, right? And so predictably, the Iraqis basically had an allergic reaction to that, where they're a paranoid police state, right? Even within Iraq. So just for example, even within Iraq, the Republican Guard is not allowed into presidential facilities. Only the SSO is allowed to have security personnel in the facilities. So even if you're a general in the Republican Guard or the Special Republican Guard, you're still not allowed into a presidential palace on your own. You still have to be escorted by the SSO. So even within Iraq, even within their security services, there were layers of trust, right? So even Iraqis weren't allowed to do certain things. And now you're asking a bunch of foreigners to run around inside your most sensitive facilities, the Iraqi intelligence service, military intelligence, Special Republican Guard, right? And at this point, Iraq knew that UNSCOM had very close connections to lots of Western foreign intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, Mossad, you name it. And so they had a not misplaced fear that anything that UNSCOM learned about the workings of these organizations would get passed on to foreign governments and could be used against Saddam and Iraq. And so it is this series of inspections, which went over the course of 2 years, that these are the ones that were getting obstructed. It was not the routine inspections of dual-use facilities that UNSCOM and IEA were running on a regular basis. It was these inspections of the regime security apparatus that were generating all of the obstruction by the Iraqis. They would deny access, they would delay access, they would let vehicles go out the back door uninspected, they would burn documents, right? And of course, UNSCOM assumed, well, these must be documents listing procurement of gyroscopes or their recipe for VX. And that truck leaving must have a Scud missile on the back. Right? The reality was, right, those documents were probably lists of spies and informants that the SSO had, lists of the standard operating procedure that the SSO used to transport Saddam from place to place. Right? That's probably what they were destroying. But if you're an UNSCOM inspector looking at what the Iraqis are doing and you're there looking for WMD, right, the natural assumption, right, was that, well, if we're looking for WMD and they're hiding stuff, they must be hiding WMD. Right? And that was in fact not the case. And what we now know from, again, from some of the documents we recovered from Iraq, including audio tapes of many meetings that Saddam had with his top officials, that the Conflict Records Research Center translated and transcribed these meetings, gives you a very amazing, in-depth view of what the Iraqi leadership thought at the time and how they're discussing these things among themselves. And I went through all of the records we have from the late 1990s. There's not one mention of Iraq trying to create this illusion of having WMD in order to fool UNSCOM, in order to deter the Iranians. There's no evidence of a deterrence by doubt strategy. Right? Instead, what you see are quotes like this, which were from a meeting in mid-June 1996. This is when the second counter-concealment inspection was going on. Iraq had just blocked UNSCOM access to Special Republican Guard facilities. And so you have Saddam Hussein, Tariq Aziz, who is his foreign minister, but also one of his closest advisors, and other senior Iraqi leaders discussing what caused this crisis and how to get out of it. Right? And as you can see from here, right, there was a very palpable concern on the part of the Iraqi leadership that this was a slippery slope where UNSCOM was going to get more and more intrusive. They wanted to get inside of these regime security facilities, not just to find WMD, right, but for more nefarious purposes. Right, and maybe would even endanger Saddam himself. And you have, there are other transcripts where Saddam explicitly says, don't let UNSCOM know where I am because they can pass the information on to the Americans who can launch cruise missiles against me. Right, so there's a very close connection between his view of what UNSCOM was trying to do in his country and his personal survival. Right, so again, this idea of regime security driving his decision-making was really paramount here. It was not about the Iranians. It was not about deterrence. It was not a national security concern where Iraq was trying to really maintain its sovereign, its dignity as a sovereign nation. Right? It was really all about protecting Saddam and his regime and making sure they stayed in power. Okay, so that's the Iraq case. In the case of Syria, it's different. So in the Iraq case, we had Saddam. We thought Saddam was planning to have weapons he didn't have. In the case of Syria, Bashar al-Assad's been using chemical weapons that many people think he shouldn't be using. He should be pretending not to have, and that would make his life a lot easier. But what we've seen is chemical weapons have really become part of the Syrian civil war since 2013. And there were, as I'll go through in a minute, right, there have been a number of cases of chemical weapons being used at different levels, but it's been fairly regular from 2013 till now. At the same time, has raised a lot of puzzles about what was actually motivating Assad's thinking. Why was he using chemical weapons at these particular times in these ways, which from the outside seem not logical or they seem counterproductive, right? And so, one of the big puzzles was, why did Assad ignore President Obama's red line in 2013 and use chemical weapons on a large scale, knowing that one of the few things that could really provoke a Western international military intervention would be the use of chemical weapons, right? Up until then, the U.S. had made it pretty clear we did not want to get heavily involved in the Syrian civil war. The one red line we set out was the use of chemical weapons, right? And yet, Assad went through that pretty blatantly in August 2013, used a massive amount of sarin, killed over 1,400 people, and did it in a way that would have been obviously hard to ignore. And he launched that attack when there were UN chemical investigators at a hotel in Damascus, literally a couple of miles away from the attack site, which made it basically impossible to hide this event from international scrutiny, and done in such a way to make it easier for the UN to do the inspections, and therefore less likely he could avoid any kind of retaliation for violating the red line. So the way that they did the attack, when they did the attack, on a certain level, just doesn't make a lot of sense. And then in this most recent case, back in April, when Assad used sarin on the town of Khan Shaykhun in Idlib province, this was used at the same time, the same days, the same week that senior members of the Trump administration, like Secretary of State Tillerson, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, were saying publicly, we have a new approach to Syria. We want to work with Assad against the Islamic State. Right? The removal of Assad is no longer a prerequisite for our approach to the Syrian civil war, right? Which is a major change in our policy. And yet, that's the exact time when he decides to up the ante and use chemical weapons on a large scale and use sarin. And again, seems counterintuitive, counterproductive to do this at the time when the Assad regime appears to be winning the war and appears to have a much more friendly administration in power in D.C. But I think, so from a national security perspective, right, some of these things don't make sense. From a regime security perspective, right, these things start to make more sense. And the problem is in the U.S. and in D.C., right, we're looking at, how did Obama's red line affect Assad? How did Trump giving him a green light affect his willingness to use chemical weapons, right? And where the debate in the U.S. at least has totally ignored the most important decision maker on this, which is Bashar al-Assad, right? And we have to stop debating the wisdom of Obama's red line and start trying to understand what are Assad's red lines? What is the behavior that he thinks is unacceptable and triggers a chemical response? And that's the key to understanding why they use chemical weapons and how to deter future use. So natural question. Okay, so what are Assad's red lines? I unfortunately do not have a direct line to the Assad regime. So this is kind of based on my best estimates. I don't also have the documents that we have in the Iraq case that kind of show the decision-making process. But if you look at when and how and where the Assad regime has used chemical weapons, I think there are two red lines that become pretty apparent. Defending Damascus and protecting Latakia province, which is the homeland of the Alawite community in Syria. Damascus, right, is the capital of the country. It's the political military center of gravity for the Assad regime. If the rebels were able to take over even large parts of the capital, it would, I think, undermine the Assad regime's legitimacy and ability to claim that it's still the rightful rulers of Syria. The capital is heavily fortified. The Assad regime has prioritized defending the capital throughout the civil war. So if, in fact, the rebels were able to take over even large parts of the capital, would, I think, really send a huge vote of no confidence in the Syrian security forces. And that would probably have knock-on effects on the confidence of the population of Syria to trust the Assad regime with their security. And Damascus also is important as the location of their major international airport that they used to receive supplies from Iran and Russia and their other allies. So losing Damascus really would probably lose the war for the Assad regime. Latakia province is also extremely important because it gives the Assad regime a huge pool of manpower, strategic depth, and also legitimacy. Right? It's the homeland of the Alawites in Syria, which is the minority group that the Assad family is from. The Assad ancestral home is in Kardaha, which is in Latakia province. Even though Alawites make up only about 12% of the population in Syria, they occupy virtually all of the senior positions in the political and military establishments. And some key military units like Unit 450, which is the unit in charge of guarding and storing and handling Syrian chemical weapons, is an all-Alawite force. And the Assad regime has relied on the Alawites to create the militias to deplete to replace the depleted Syrian army that's obviously been attrited very heavily throughout this conflict. And Assad has used a very sectarian narrative throughout this civil war. This is a war where the Islamic State and the other terrorists are seeking to annihilate the Alawites. And he's used that rhetoric to mobilize the Alawite base and population, gain loyal foot soldiers for the conflict. But at the same time, because of the atrocities the Assad regime has committed against its Sunni opponents, they've also created a scenario where Sunnis, I think by and large, look at Alawites as guilty by association. Right? So the Assad regime, even though this conflict did not start sectarian, right, it's turned very sectarian now. And so the Alawites are in a position where they need Assad to protect them from the vengeance of the rebels if they're victorious, and they need Assad as much as Assad needs them for their manpower. And there's also a notion, we don't really know if this is true or not, but a notion that if Damascus fell or was imperiled, right, the Assad regime would move to Latakia province and continue the fight, and they would maintain kind of a coastal bastion to hold on to as much of Syria as possible. And so the rebels know this, and so the rebels have at times purposely targeted Damascus and Latakia, knowing these are the centers of gravity of the Assad regime. And it's when they do that, it's when they launch major offensives in Damascus, when they launch major offensives in Latakia, that's typically when the Assad regime uses chemical weapons. Right? The use of the chemical weapons it's not random, it's not arbitrary, there's a strategic logic that's guiding them. So this is a summary of some of those red lines when they get crossed and what the response is from the Assad regime. So just to briefly kind of highlight this, the first evidence of chemical weapons being used in the Syrian conflict came in the spring of 2013 in the outskirts of Damascus, where there's very heavy fighting between the government and rebels over key suburbs of Damascus. And that's where you start seeing improvised sarin munitions being used on a small scale against rebel fighters, right, which coincided with a major rebel push to get from the suburbs into Damascus center, but still sporadic, limited use. On August 4th, a coalition of rebel groups launched the first major offensive into Latakia province called Operation Liberate the Coast. And the next day, we see the first sarin-filled rocket being used in the conflict, at least the first one we know about, and used against the Damascus suburb of Adra, which was a rebel-held territory. But that rocket didn't function properly, apparently, and it injured 100 people, but no one died. A couple of days later, Assad is driving down the street in central Damascus, and he's attacked by mortars launched from rebel forces in the outskirts of the city. But they had good enough intelligence to know where Assad would be, and they're able to launch an attack. The combination of these two events, right, where you have this major offensive in Latakia, which, by the way, Latakia province up until this point was almost untouched by the civil war, was lightly guarded. And so when the rebels launched that offensive on August 4th, they made very rapid progress. They took over about a dozen villages within the span of a couple days, and they massacred several hundred people right away, and they took several hundred more people captive. So it was a very shocking turnabout for the Assad regime, that their homeland, which was supposed to be safe, was now being violated by the rebels, and now Assad himself is being targeted by rebel forces. And so this put in place planning for a major government offensive to clear the rebels out of these suburbs of Damascus. Right? They'd been tolerated for too long. They were too close. They were posing too much of a danger to his survival. And so the government launched this Capitol Shield operation on August 21st. And as part of that operation was this massive use of chemical weapons. About a dozen rockets filled with sarin were launched at different rebel-held suburbs, right, as part of this conventional military offensive as well. Right? And this is the event, the attack on Ghouta, which killed 1,400 people. But this was a response to the most severe, I think, internal crisis that the Assad regime had faced up to this point, because of these two simultaneous challenges to their two most important red lines. And of course, this attack, right, eventually led to the Syrian government agreeing to join the Chemical Weapons Convention, agreeing to give up its chemical weapons, and they started implementing it shortly thereafter. But then in the next year, in March, the rebels launched another offensive into Latakia province. At this point, right, Syria is supposed to have gotten rid of all of its chemical weapons mostly. So what they do is they improvise. And this is where you see the emergence of the chlorine barrel bombs for the first time. In April 11th, this is when the Assad regime starts using the chlorine barrel bombs, which are militarily not effective. Rarely do they kill anyone. But because of the fear of chemical weapons in general, the fear of dying through suffocation, the very distinct signature of the yellow-green gas, right? The Assad regime found this to be a very effective weapon for terrorizing civilians, driving them out of rebel-held territory, and then generally trying to demoralize them and separating the population away from their support for the different rebel groups. And so you see now the beginning of a concerted campaign of chlorine barrel bomb attacks throughout into the province right after this first incursion into Latakia. These chlorine barrel bombs attacks continue for a couple years. It's very sporadic. I think at this point you have two things going on. One is there's a very muted response from the U.S. about these chlorine barrel bomb attacks. So I think the Assad regime realizes that these don't cross the red line that Obama had set out in terms of what will provoke a U.S. response. And this is in part because these weapons are not highly lethal, right? They're not killing thousands of people. They are chemical weapons, right? They are illegal under international law, illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention. But I think the Assad regime calculated that we can modulate the use of these weapons enough to keep it under the threshold that will trigger an international response. And I think also at this point, the Assad regime has delegated some of its decision-making on this to some of the lower-level military commanders and gave them more authority to use these weapons in a more tactical way, not necessarily driven by the strategic considerations. But again, very sporadic, but continuous throughout for the next 2 years. But no sarin, no major attacks. Right, this all changes right earlier this year, and again, this was, I think the trigger here was on March 19th. Rebels launched only their second major offensive into Damascus. Right, so the first one was August 2013. Damascus relatively quiet since that time. They launched a new offensive in March 19th, in part because the government's getting better at squeezing the last remaining rebel-held suburbs around Damascus, and I think the rebels were trying to break out and trying to counteract some of that the siege warfare that was going on. But they were using car bombs in Damascus. They were launching rockets and artillery. And again, because this was a very surprising event, again, it triggered the Assad regime to escalate. And they escalated the same way they did in 2013, was using sarin. And so you see the first response on March 30th. There is a Syrian aircraft that dropped a sarin bomb on the town of Latamina, which only injured 169 people. They were all reporting symptoms consistent with nerve agent poisoning, but again, no one died. That apparently was not sufficient of a response. And so you see a couple days later the attack on Khan Shaykhun, which wound up killing 100 people, injuring hundreds more. And that obviously then triggered the U.S. cruise missile strike on Syria shortly thereafter. Right, but when this attack happened, right, again, this was right the same week that the Trump administration was making sympathetic noises, right, about the Assad regime, and was saying, well, we can work with Assad against the Islamic State. And so some people said, well, it's a green light, right? Trump gave Assad a green light. It's his fault this happened. I just don't think that's the case. I think the Assad regime cares a lot less about what people are saying in D.C. They care a lot more about what's going on the ground in the middle of their civil war, right? And this was a singular development, right, that we'd not seen for the last couple of years. But it fits this pattern of rebel violations of these self-declared, or self-imposed red lines, triggering a chemical response. And I think the idea is both these are means of revenge, right? Against, especially referring back to the Latakia, right? The idea that we're going to avenge our fallen Alawite brothers and sisters, also reassure the other Alawites that we take your security seriously, and also sending a signal to the rebels, right? If you cross these red lines, you will be punished severely, right? The Syrian civil war obviously is already very brutal, right? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have already died, but this is a way of sending a signal that that there are some things the Assad regime views as being unacceptable, and we will escalate in ways that will increase your pain even more than they are now. And I think the Assad regime has used chemical weapons in that way throughout the conflict. Okay, one last point. I said in the beginning that the agencies involved in a WMD program are different for a regime security program than a national security program, and the Syrian case bears that out. If you look at the command and control and the chain of command for the Syrian chemical weapons program, the individuals and the organizations involved are heavily drawn from the security agencies, from military intelligence, the political security directorate, and especially the Air Force intelligence, which is not like our Air Force intelligence, because back when Hafez Assad became president of Syria, he'd been an Air Force pilot, so he turned to the Air Force intelligence directorate and turned them into his own private security agency. And they actually, aside from their very kind of generic title, right, they are actually the leading regime security organization within Syria. They're entrusted with the most sensitive tasks, both inside Syria and outside Syria, in terms of assassinations and covert operations. This is the organization that used to control Syrian chemical weapons. Right, Unit 450 used to be part of Air Force intelligence before it got moved to the Syrian the Scientific Studies Research Center. But they are still heavily involved in planning and conducting the chemical attacks that Syria is still conducting. So if you're looking at a kind of conventional military chain of command, right, that will not help you understand how the Syrian system is set up. Right, it's based on security agencies. It's based on loyalty of individuals, right? Not the hierarchy on paper of who outranks whom. It's much more important where your loyalties lie, what your ethnicity is, and what organization you're part of. Okay, so let me give you spend a couple minutes talking about some of the policy implications that flow out of this research and this analysis, which are go beyond the Iraq and Syria case, but I'll kind of run through a couple of these. So the first is right, we need to rethink about deterrence in this context. All of the major studies and scenarios that I've seen, at least, right, all look at deterrence in terms of how do we deter a state from using WMD against another state or against the United States. Right? There is very little, if anything, that I've seen, at least open unclassified, that looks at how do we deter a government from using WMD against their own people. That's just a scenario we don't think about. And yet, as we've seen in the case of Syria, right, that scenario could very well happen. It might drag the U.S. into a war. And so it would behoove us to do more research to understand how can we affect that calculation. And so far, the historical record is not very promising. Right? We failed to deter Saddam's use of chemical weapons against the Kurds in the 80s. We failed to deter Saddam's use of chemical weapons against the Shia after the first Gulf War. And obviously, we failed multiple times here in Syria. And partly, there's just this fundamental asymmetry of interests. Right? That a dictator who is facing a revolution or a rebellion, right? He's willing to run much higher costs to stay in power, right, than we are going to be willing to inflict to remove him from power, right? So there's a fundamental asymmetry that we have to figure out a way to get around. And so again, we need to do a lot more work on how to figure that out. So I promise you that we'll talk about nukes as well, right? I know a lot of you here, that's your main interest. I think there's some implications here for nuclear security and nuclear nonproliferation as well. There is already some work that uses regime security to look at nuclear command and control. So for example, Peter Fever's work about assertive versus delegative command and control systems. He says that countries that have a poor record of civilian military interactions, they will more likely have assertive command and control systems so civilians can hold on to control the nuclear weapons more tightly. And in fact, what we've seen is that the countries that have worse civ-mil relations, right, like China, right, they do have tighter, more centralized command and control over the nuclear weapons. So there is some evidence that the civ-mil relations does affect how nuclear forces are operated and designed. But that's during peacetime. During wartime or during crises, we've also seen in the case of France, China, Soviet Union, right, we've seen near misses where countries facing coups or domestic instability almost lose control of nuclear facilities or nuclear weapons. And we've had a couple of near misses where that's happened. And so the idea that just because you're a nuclear weapon state, even though you might have built your weapons to deter foreign enemies, doesn't mean they won't get repurposed, either by the government, right, or by domestic rivals who are seeking to unseat that government. Again, I haven't seen a lot of any real unclassified analyses looking at that. All the things I've seen in terms of the collapse of North Korea, a Taliban takeover of Pakistan, right, looks at, well, what happens if a government loses control of its nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, its WMD, or a hostile government takes over, right? Not a lot of analysis of, well, how could the government use these weapons in the midst of a civil war? And either use them physically or use them in a symbolic way. And likewise, to what extent would these weapons or these facilities become pawns or targets of rebels or opposition movements in the event of a civil conflict within a country that has nuclear weapons? And so that, I think, requires some more analysis and thinking through. Because even in the realm of chemical and biological weapons, where there's been a natural tendency to look at, okay, these are weapons designed for deterrence, for national security means, and yet we see that authoritarian leaders who care first and foremost about maintaining their own personal safety and survival, they'll use any means at their disposal. So in the case of Iraq, in the case of Syria, they developed chemical weapons to deter foreign enemies, but when the internal threat became severe, right, they repurposed those weapons to use against domestic opponents. I don't see any logical reason why a Kim Jong-un or a leader in Pakistan or somewhere else might not have the same logic won't drive them there as well, right? The way that we think about nuclear weapons in the Western deterrent arms control context is just not the way that countries with authoritarian governments and autocratic regimes would necessarily think about these weapons. And so we have to look at these things more from their perspective than kind of our old way of thinking. Verification also becomes more challenging under this kind of scenario. We've already saw in the case of Iraq where concerns about regime security interfere with the ability of an outside organization to come in and do intrusive inspections, because in any authoritarian regime, right, secrecy is highly prized for many reasons. WMD programs tend to be also obviously very highly secretive, but especially when you have regime security organizations involved with the WMD program, right, that's where you get the most intense levels of secrecy and the greater difficulty, the more challenge of those countries opening up their facilities to outside inspections. I think this is part of what's happened in Syria, where the OPCW has not gotten as much access to the Syrian program as they would have liked. I think this is part of the reason why the IEA has had a hard time getting into Parchin in Iran, because Parchin's run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. IRGC is not just a military unit. Their job is also regime security. They're also in charge of suppressing domestic unrest, protecting the leadership from threats both foreign and domestic. And so that just raises an extra level of complexity when you now want foreign inspectors to come in to a facility that has ties to regime protection. That just creates a whole new level of sensitivity in those countries. Intelligence analysis also, I think, would benefit because if you look at a country's WMD program only through those three traditional lenses or theories, right, national security, domestic politics, prestige, right, and you don't think about regime security, right, you run the risk of falling victim to omitted variable bias, right, because you don't consider all of the options. You put undue weight on the ones that you know about. And I think that's exactly what happened in the case of Iraq, where, and I've talked to some of the analysts who were working in some of these agencies at the time, where they looked at Iraq and they said, oh, of course, Iraq built these weapons, for national security reasons, and so if they're hiding stuff, it's because it's for national security and they're hiding WMD. A handful of analysts knew enough about Iraq's kind of paranoid police state mentality to raise the issue of, well, maybe they just don't like foreigners coming into their version of the FBI and CIA and Secret Service. But that insight never got up to the higher levels within the intelligence community. And so we were blindsided. And actually, I now have a copy of a declassified CIA retrospective analysis that was written in '06, looking back saying, oh yeah, you know what? We totally misread Iraq's intentions. And we now understand that because of their kind of police state mentality, that they were reacting to the inspections of their regime security organizations, right? So people now kind of get it. But again, this is not kind of accepted. I don't think this is the accepted reason for why Iraq behaved the way it did. So in terms of needing intelligence analysts to look at the regime security motivations for countries and how they pursue their weapons and what might happen to them in the event of a conflict or instability, I think that's important. I have one data point which is a little discouraging. CIA Director Mike Pompeo was at the Aspen Security Forum earlier this month, and someone asked him about why is Bashar al-Assad using chemical weapons, and Pompeo said something to the effect of, I don't know, I don't want to get inside of his head. And that's exactly the wrong mentality. We have to get inside the heads of these leaders, and knowing that they have totally different value systems and priorities and calculations, but we need to understand what those are. And if we look at it from this purely Western national security mindset, and we don't think about all of the ways in which these leaders fear their own people more than they fear us, we're just going to miss a lot. Right? And I think especially when we talk about North Korea and Kim Jong-un, who clearly has a major insecurity about his legitimacy. Right? I think that's why he lashed out against Sony. That's why he's been so vigorous developing nuclear program and the missile program, why he assassinated his half-brother in a Malaysian airport. He's deeply insecure. And that can drive behaviors in ways that would not make sense from a national security perspective, but when you flip it and you look at it from how does this affect his standing within his own country, right? You get a different set of assumptions you need to be making and looking at. So I think that's a key takeaway. Last point, advances in science technology. The way we look at advances in chemistry and biotechnology and biology typically is to how will these advances improve create more advanced chemical and biological weapons for use on a battlefield. And so we look at what are the characteristics that would be of most use to a military: lethality, stability, dissemination, area coverage, because that's what you'd want if you're using these things on the battlefield. The regime security model says, well, if you're talking about an autocratic regime, authoritarian government who's afraid of their own people, they might be looking to harness these advances in technologies for totally different purposes, right? How do we develop means of controlling our populations, suppressing dissent, silencing critics in ways that would not draw the ire of the international community? What are ways that we can use advances in neuroscience and neurotechnology to improve interrogation techniques? Or what are ways that we can develop chemical weapons or biochemical agents that can affect cognition or emotion? Or, getting a little more sci-fi, but not too much, right? What about creating ethnic weapons? Right, biological weapons that have some genetic signature in them that will only target certain populations that have that shared signature. Again, it's right now not possible, but we're moving in that direction. All right, and from a national security perspective, right, that would having a genocidal weapon of that makes no sense. But if you are the leader of an autocratic regime and your support is 10% of the population and you're worried about the other 90%, right, having something like that would make more sense. And we have seen some cases of governments thinking this way. Back in the 1980s, under the apartheid regime, South Africa had a chemical and biological weapons program called Project Coast. One of the things they were working on was an anti-fertility vaccine that they were going to give to black women in order to make them infertile. And this was their way of creating a long-term solution to the imbalance in the population within South Africa and a way of sustaining the apartheid regime. It didn't work. They didn't get very far in the science. It never got implemented. But just thinking along those lines, right, is something that that other governments might think of as well. Also, we have cases of developing incapacitating biological and chemical weapons. We had a case in 2002 in Russia where the Russian authorities used an opioid derivative to knock out Chechen terrorists who had taken a theater hostage. They accidentally killed most of the hostages, but this was one of the first applications of a so-called non-lethal weapon. And it was designed for counterterrorism purposes, but you can think of, okay, well, what would the utility of that kind of agent have been to Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria, Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, if they'd had a means of neutralizing large crowds of protesters in a way that was not bloody and did not trigger the spotlight of CNN and international scrutiny. So the idea that autocratic regimes might be looking for ways to develop untraceable poisons to go after critics and dissidents, which we've seen the Russians do, developing fast-acting incapacitants to use for crowd control or for disrupting large protests. Again, these are things that we would not think of developing in the US, right? That's not the applications of technology we're afraid of being used against us, but that mindset that might drive other countries with this different mentality, this different set of priorities and concerns in that direction. So the way we look at these advanced technology also needs to be a little bit broader when we consider what this means. In summary, hopefully I've given you a good introduction to what this regime security model kind of predicts, how it's different from the other models that are out there in the world of proliferation. The Iraq and Syria case studies were really kind of trying to just show how useful this theory can be to explain some otherwise fairly puzzling behavior, and hopefully led you with some food for thought about some of the policy implications. In the event that you want to do even more reading on this, I'll leave you with the citations for some of the work I've done.